The man's voice is a rusty hammer, striking again and again in the brittle air of the saloon. He stands on a crate, a greasy gavel in his hand, his eyes sweeping over the grimy faces of miners and drifters. Below him, propped on a chair like a discarded doll, a young woman shivers, her skin slick with a feverish sheen. Her name is Alara, though no one here uses it. To them, she is merely the consignment. Do I hear $5? The makeshift auctioneer bellows, spittle flying. $5 for the mail-order bride, train ticket paid. A bit under the weather, but a good cleaning will fix her right up. A cruel laugh ripples through the room. The man who was meant to be her husband, a sour-faced rancher named Jedediah, leans against the bar, a smirk twisting his lips. He'd taken one look at her stumbling off the train, coughing and weak, and declared her damaged goods now. He aims to recoup his travel expenses. The town, starved for cruel entertainment, is happy to oblige. Alara's head lolls, her vision swimming. The jeers and bids blur into a meaningless roar. She is an object, a piece of faulty merchandise to be sold for scrap. This is the end of her road, 1,000 miles from a home she couldn't keep, ending in a town that sees her as less than human. The auctioneer raises his gavel, his eyes landing on a leering mule skinner who just raised a grimy hand. Just as he is about to bring it down, the batwing doors of the saloon swing open with a sudden, sharp creak. A figure stands silhouetted against the blinding afternoon sun, tall and broad-shouldered. As he steps inside, a hush falls over the room. It is not the sheriff. It is Dr. Silas Mercer. He is the only doctor for 100 miles, a man whose hands are skilled enough to set a bone or dig out a bullet, yet whose skin color makes him a permanent outsider. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, take in the scene in an instant. The auctioneer on his crate, the jeering crowd, and the sick young woman at the center of it all. His face, usually a mask of calm professionalism, sets into a line of cold, controlled fury. He ignores the muttering and the hostile stares, his gaze fixed on Alara. He can see the rapid, shallow breaths, the flush of high fever, the tremor in her limbs. This isn't a spectacle, it's a death sentence. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't have to. It cuts through the silence like a surgeon's blade, precise and unyielding. The auction is over. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The auctioneer, a portly man named Grimes who owned the saloon, sputtered. Now, see here, document. This is town business. Silas takes another step into the room, and the men nearest the door instinctively shrink back. He is not an imposing man by way of threat, but by the sheer force of his presence, an aura of intellect and purpose that makes their brutishness seem small and pathetic. This, Silas says, his voice dangerously low, is a medical emergency. That woman has a fever that could kill her. And you are standing here haggling over her like a sack of feed. He pauses, letting his words hang in the foul air. I'm taking her. Jedediah pushes himself off the bar. You ain't talking nothing, Mercer. I paid her passage. She owes me. Silas's gaze snaps to Jedediah, and for the first time, there's a flicker of pure, undisguised contempt in his eyes. You would let her die for the price of a train ticket? He doesn't wait for an answer. He pulls a worn leather purse from his coat, his movements deliberate. He walks directly to the bar, ignoring Jedediah, and places a gold eagle on the sticky wood. $10. More than any of these men would have paid. This covers the debt, he says to the bartender. Then he turns back to the room. Now, get out of my way. He walks toward Alara, his long coat sweeping the dusty floorboards, his purpose absolute. With that one act, that one cold, hard coin on the bar, he hasn't just bought a woman's freedom. He has declared war on the town's casual cruelty. His life, and hers, were irrevocably changed. The ride to his small clapboard house on the edge of town was a blur for Alara. She remembered the strange sensation of being lifted, the strength in the arms that held her, and the scent of antiseptic and clean linen, a stark contrast to the saloon's stench of stale beer and sweat. She was bundled into the back of his buggy, wrapped in a thick wool blanket that felt like the first kindness she'd known in weeks. Through the fog of her fever, she was vaguely aware of the stairs, the whispers that followed them through the dusty main street. A black doctor, riding off with a white woman. She knew, even in her delirium, that this was a dangerous act. Silas Mercer had arrived in Redemption Creek 3 years prior. He'd come from the East, a graduate of one of the few medical colleges that would accept a man of his race, carrying with him a quiet dignity and a medical bag filled with more knowledge than the last 3 sawbones the town had employed combined. They needed him. They needed him when a mine shaft collapsed, when cholera swept through the shanties, when a child was gored by a longhorn. They would call for him in the dead of night, their prejudice momentarily eclipsed by their desperation. They would pay him, often grudgingly, and then pretend he didn't exist until the next emergency. He lived in a small house that served as both his home and his clinic. It was set apart from the town proper, as if by an unspoken agreement. The isolation suited him. It gave him peace to read his medical journals, to cultivate his small garden of medicinal herbs, to simply be without the constant weight of judgment. He had learned to build a fortress of solitude, its walls made of professionalism and emotional distance. Alara's journey had been born of a different kind of desperation. An orphan raised by a stern aunt and uncle, she had been another mouth to feed on a failing farm. The advertisement for a mail-order bride had seemed like a lifeline, a promise of a new start, a home of her own. The man, Jedediah, had sounded sturdy and respectable in his letters. He had promised a good life. The reality had been a slap in the face. The cough she'd picked up in the crowded, dirty train car had worsened with every mile, and by the time she'd arrived, fever was blooming behind her eyes. Jedediah's look of disgust had been more painful than any symptom. He hadn't seen a potential wife. He'd seen a liability. And in the West, liabilities were discarded. Now, she lay in a narrow bed in a room that smelled of dried lavender and carbolic soap. It was a simple room, but immaculately clean. A single window looked out onto the endless, rolling prairie. Her first lucid thought was that she was no longer in the saloon. Her second was a spike of fear. Where was she? Who was this man? Silas entered the room as quietly as he had entered the saloon. He carried a tray with a bowl of thin broth and a cup of willow bark tea. He didn't speak, just set the tray on the small bedside table. He moved with an economy of motion that was both calming and intensely focused. Where? Alara's voice was a dry rasp. My home, he said, his tone even. You are safe here. You have a severe inflammation of the lungs. You need rest, fluids, and this. He gestured to the steaming tea. It will help with the fever. She stared at him, trying to reconcile the terrifying figure from her fevered imagination with the calm, serious man before her. The town's scornful whispers echoed in her memory, warnings her aunt had given about strange men, strange places. She shrank back against the pillows. Silas saw the fear in her eyes and felt a familiar, weary pang. He was used to it. He saw it in the eyes of children, in the hesitant way a rancher's wife would let him examine her. He simply pulled a chair over to the corner of the room, opened a thick medical text, and began to read. He did not hover. He did not press her. He simply created a space of quiet, watchful care. He would be her doctor first. The rest, he knew, was a chasm of complication he hadn't yet allowed himself to consider. He had acted on instinct, on the oath he had taken to preserve life. Now, in the silence of his home, with the scorn of the town settling like dust on his doorstep, the consequences of that act began to take shape. The first few days passed in a haze of fever dreams and fitful sleep. Alara was adrift on a sea of sickness, and Silas was her only anchor. He was a constant, quiet presence. He would check her temperature, listen to her ragged breathing with his stethoscope, and coax her to drink the bitter tea and swallow the broth he prepared. He spoke only when necessary, his voice calm and steady, explaining what he was doing in simple, clinical terms. In her moments of clarity, she would watch him. He moved around his small home with a practiced efficiency. Everything had its place. The rows of glass bottles filled with tinctures and powders, the neatly stacked books, the polished medical instruments gleaming in a glass case. It was a world of order and purpose, so different from the chaos she had escaped. She noticed the small things, the way he meticulously washed his hands before and after touching her, the gentle but firm way he would help her sit up to drink, the careful mending on his own shirt cuffs. This was not the act of a man who had purchased a woman for his own use. This was the work of a healer. One afternoon, the fever broke. She awoke drenched in sweat, but her mind was clear for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The room was quiet, filled with the soft, late afternoon light. Silas was not there. Slowly, painstakingly, she pushed herself into a sitting position. Her body ached and felt as weak as a newborn kitten's, but her head was clear. She saw her dress, the one she'd arrived in, hanging on a peg by the door. It had been washed and pressed. Beside it was a simple, clean nightgown she was currently wearing. The front door opened, and Silas came in, carrying a basket of roots from his garden. He stopped when he saw her sitting up, his expression unreadable. "The fever is gone," she whispered. It was a statement of fact, but it felt like a miracle. He nodded, setting his basket down on the main table. "Your body fought it off. You are still weak. You must not overexert yourself." He moved to the stove, his back to her. "I will prepare some food. Something more substantial." The silence that followed was different. It was no longer the silence of sickness and delirium, but the awkward silence of two strangers who were bound together by an extraordinary circumstance. She was indebted to him, not for the price of a train ticket, but for her life. The thought was overwhelming. "Thank you," she said, her voice a little stronger now. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders seemed to relax slightly. "It is my work," he replied simply. A few days later, she was strong enough to leave the bed and sit in the chair by the window. From there, she had a view of his world. She watched him tend his garden, his long fingers surprisingly deft as he worked the soil. She watched him grind herbs with a mortar and pestle, his focus absolute. She saw the occasional patient arrive at his door, a cowboy with a hand sliced open by barbed wire, a mother with a fretful, colicky baby. Silas treated them all with the same detached, professional courtesy. But she also saw the way they looked at the house, their eyes darting towards her window before they scurried away. She was a curiosity, a scandal. The woman the black doctor had bought. The first direct confrontation with the town's malice came in the form of Jedediah. He rode up to the house one morning, reining his horse in so hard it threw its head back in protest. He didn't dismount. He sat in his saddle, a portrait of belligerent arrogance. "Mercer," he yelled. Silas, who had been chopping wood, set the axe down carefully and walked towards the fence that separated his property from the dusty track. He didn't speak, just waited. "I hear you got my property in there," Jedediah sneered, nodding his head towards the house. Alara, watching from the window, felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach. "She is not your property," Silas said, his voice level. "She is my patient." "Patient?" Jedediah laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Looks recover enough to me. I paid her passage. That $10 you threw down don't cover my trouble. I want her back. A woman's got to earn her keep." The veiled threat was unmistakable. Silas's hands, hanging loose at his sides, clenched into fists. But his voice remained dangerously calm. "The arrangement you had with her was contingent on a marriage you refused to enter into. You have no claim on her, legal or otherwise. You are trespassing, Mr. Fletcher. I suggest you leave." "Or what?" Jedediah challenged, his hand moving towards the pistol on his hip. "You'll what, Doc?" From the window, Alara watched, her heart pounding. She saw the tension in Silas's shoulders, the rigid set of his jaw. He was alone. The law in this town, in the form of the portly and ineffectual Sheriff Miller, would side with Jedediah. For a black man to challenge a white landowner was a line that couldn't be crossed without consequence. But Silas did not back down. "I will document this conversation," he said, his words precise and cold. "I will note your threats, your attempt at intimidation. in your flagrant disregard for a private citizen's well-being. And should any harm befall Miss Alara, I will personally see to it that the U.S. Marshals are notified that the local sheriff is either complicit or incompetent. Now, leave my property." Jedediah hesitated. The threat of federal law, of outside interference, was one of the few things men like him respected. He glared at Silas, his face a mask of thwarted rage. "This ain't over, Mercer," he spat, before yanking his horse's reins and galloping away in a cloud of dust. When Silas came back inside, his face was grim. He didn't look at Alara, but went straight to his medical cabinet and poured himself a small glass of whiskey, a rare indulgence. He drank it in one swallow. Alara found her voice. "He will not stop." "No," Silas agreed, finally looking at her. His eyes were dark with a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. "He will not." In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted again. She was no longer just a patient. She was the cause of a danger that now threatened him, his home, his livelihood. And she saw in his eyes not resentment, but a grim, protective resolve. As her strength returned, Alara began to impose her own quiet order on the house. It began small. While Silas was out on a call, she took the broth pot and scrubbed it until it shone. She mended the tear in the curtains she'd noticed from her sickbed. She swept the floor and dusted the endless rows of books. She did it not out of a sense of obligation, but out of a desperate need to contribute, to be more than a burden, more than the consignment. Silas would return to find these small changes. He never commented on them, but she would see him pause, his eyes taking in the neatened space. One evening, he came home late, exhausted from delivering twins at a ranch 10 miles out. The fire was lit, and a simple stew of potatoes and the roots from his garden was simmering on the stove. A loaf of bread, misshapen but undeniably bread, was cooling on a cloth. He had not had fresh bread in years. He stood in the doorway, the weariness falling away from him for a moment, replaced by a look of sheer, unguarded surprise. Alara stood by the hearth, wiping her hands on an apron she had fashioned from a clean flour sack. "I found some flour in the pantry," she said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "I hope you wouldn't mind." Silas took off his coat and hung it on its peg. He walked to the stove and lifted the lid from the pot, inhaling the steam. For a long moment, he said nothing. Alara's heart sank. Perhaps she had overstepped. Then he turned to her, and for the first time since she'd met him, a genuine, small smile touched the corners of his mouth. It transformed his serious face, revealing a warmth she hadn't known was there. "I do not mind at all, Alara," he said, using her name for the first time. The sound of it in his deep, quiet voice was more reassuring than any sermon. They ate in their usual silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was filled with the comforting sounds of a shared meal, the warmth of the fire, the unspoken acknowledgement of a partnership being forged. She was learning his rhythms, the deep concentration he entered when reading, the quiet sigh he let out when he thought no one was listening. He, in turn, was learning hers. He saw the way she cared for the house, her quiet determination, the resilience that shone in her eyes now that the fear had receded. He started leaving the medical journals with the most interesting illustrations open on the table, and he noticed she would study them, her brow furrowed in concentration. The town, however, did not forget. Their fragile peace was constantly under assault. Silas's practice began to dwindle. People who had once called on him for every ailment now turned to folk remedies or simply suffered in silence. Whispers followed Alara whenever she had to venture to the general store for supplies. The women would pull their children closer, their faces pinched with disapproval. The men would stare, their expressions a mixture of contempt and a crude, invasive curiosity. Sheriff Miller paid them a visit one afternoon. He was a large man who seemed to overflow his uniform, his face perpetually slick with sweat. He avoided Silas's direct gaze, focusing instead on a spot on the far wall. "Silas," he began, his tone attempting a man-to-man familiarity that rang false. "Folks are talking." "They often do," Silas replied, not inviting him to sit. This situation, with the girl, the sheriff shifted his weight. It's unseemly. Jedediah Fletcher has lodged a formal complaint. Says you're holding her against her will. Before Silas could respond, Alara stepped forward from the kitchen doorway. Her hands were white-knuckled at her sides, but her voice was clear and steady. I'm not being held here, Sheriff. Dr. Mercer saved my life. I am staying of my own free will. The sheriff finally looked at her, his eyes narrowed. Is that so? A young woman like you, living with it doesn't look right. What looks right, Sheriff? Silas interjected, his voice like ice. Leaving her to be auctioned off in a saloon? Letting a man like Jedediah claim her like a stray dog? I'm giving her shelter. Is that a crime in Redemption Creek? It's causing trouble, Miller blustered, his face turning red. Fletcher's a landowner. He has influence. He's talking about getting the town council to revoke your license to practice. The threat hung in the air, potent and real. This was Silas's life, his purpose. To take it away from him would be to destroy him. Alara felt a surge of cold fury. These people, who had used his skill and then discarded him, now sought to strip him of the one thing that defined him, all because he had shown her a kindness they were incapable of. You tell Mr. Fletcher, Alara said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed, that if he or anyone else bothers Dr. Mercer again, I will be the one to write to the U.S. Marshals. I will tell them how I was treated. I will tell them about the auction. And I will tell them how the town's sheriff stood by and let it happen. Sheriff Miller stared at her, his jaw slack. He had come expecting a frightened, malleable girl. He found a defiant woman. He looked from her resolute face to Silas's unyielding one. He was outnumbered, not by force, but by a moral conviction he couldn't comprehend. Now, I'm just giving you a friendly warning, he mumbled, backing towards the door. Just be careful. He turned and practically fled, not looking back. The door closed, leaving them in the sudden quiet. The air was thick with unspoken things. Alara was trembling, the adrenaline fading, leaving her feeling weak. Silas turned to her. His face was a complex mask of emotions. Anger at the sheriff, concern for her, and something else, something that looked like awe. You should not have done that, he said, but there was no admonishment in his voice. You have put yourself in greater danger. He threatened you, she said simply, looking up at him. He threatened your work. They have no right. He took a step closer. The space between them seemed to vibrate with a new intensity. He had saved her from a fever of the body. Now, she had stood as a shield against the sickness of the town. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a patient, not as a responsibility, but as the woman she had become, strong, fierce, and loyal. He saw the fire in her blue eyes, the proud set of her shoulders. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before his fingers gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, a spark in the quiet room. It was the first time he had touched her as anything other than a doctor. No, he said, his voice a low murmur. They have no right. In that moment, the foundation of their relationship shifted from one of gratitude and protection to one of mutual defense. They were no longer just a doctor and his ward. They were allies. And in the heart of that alliance, a more delicate, more terrifying, and more profound connection was beginning to bloom. They were two solitary souls who had found in each other a refuge from a hostile world. But they both knew the world would not leave them be. The storm was not over. It was just gathering its strength. The uneasy peace that followed Sheriff Miller's visit was thin as ice over deep water. Jedediah Fletcher, publicly thwarted by a woman he considered his property and a man he considered his inferior, was not one to forgive or forget. He began a campaign of slow, poisonous attrition. He stood on the street corner outside the general store, telling anyone who would listen that Dr. Mercer was an unnatural man, that the girl was his prisoner, held captive by strange medicines and dark intentions. Patients who had secretly still visited Silas now stopped coming altogether. A rock was thrown through the clinic window one night, shattering the glass and the fragile sense of security they had managed to build. Silas calmly swept up the shards and boarded the window, his face a stony mask but Alara saw the flicker of pain in his eyes. This house, this clinic, was his life's work, a sanctuary of science and reason in a world governed by ignorance and hate. And it was being desecrated because of her. The guilt was a heavy cloak she could not shrug off. One evening, as she was darning one of his shirts by the firelight, she finally gave voice to the fear that had been haunting her. "I should leave," she said, not looking up from her needlework. The words felt like stones in her mouth. Silas stopped his work, where he was carefully labeling a new set of botanical samples. He looked at her, his expression serious. "Leave? Where would you go?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "To another town. Find work as a seamstress, a laundress. Anywhere. Before they destroy everything you've built." "He is not destroying it because of you, Alara," Silas said, his voice firm. "He is using you as an excuse. Men like Fletcher need a target for their own bitterness. If it were not you, it would be something else. My methods, my education, the color of my skin. You are just the most convenient weapon he has found." "But I am the weapon," she insisted, finally looking at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "If I am gone, he will have no weapon left to use against you." Silas stood up and walked over to the hearth, standing before her. He looked down at her, and the professional distance he so carefully maintained was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability that mirrored her own. "And what of you?" he asked softly. "What would happen to you? Another town, another Jedediah? Do you think the world is so full of kindness that you can simply walk into it alone and be safe?" He knelt before her, taking the mending from her nerveless fingers. "I did not pull you from that saloon only to cast you back into the wilderness, Alara." Her breath hitched. "But your life." "My life," he said, his gaze intense, was quiet. It was orderly, and it was empty. I had my work, my books. I had convinced myself that was enough. He paused, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "I was wrong. You are not the weapon being used against me. You are the reason I have remembered what it is to fight for something more than a principle. To fight for a person." The confession hung in the air between them, more powerful than any declaration of love. It was an admission of need, of connection, a truth stripped bare by the threat that surrounded them. Alara could only stare at him, her heart aching with a mixture of terror and a soaring, impossible hope. To be seen, truly seen, not as a burden or an object, but as a source of strength. It was a gift she had never dared to imagine. Their moment was shattered by the sound of pounding on the door. It wasn't the hesitant knock of a patient, but the hard, demanding blows of an angry mob. Silas was on his feet in an instant, pushing Alara behind him. "Stay away from the door," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. Jedediah's voice roared from outside. "Mercer, send the girl out. The town council has spoken. We're running you out of town on a rail, and we're taking what's ours." Through the boarded-up window, they could see the flickering light of torches. There were at least a dozen men out there, their faces twisted by drink and self-righteous fury. Sheriff Miller stood among them, not as a keeper of the peace, but as a passive endorser of the mob. This was it, the final, decisive confrontation. All the whispers, the threats, the hatred had coalesced into this one violent moment. Silas looked around his home, at his books, his instruments, the life he had so carefully constructed. Then he looked at Alara, her face pale, but her eyes resolute. He had a shotgun over the mantelpiece, but he knew that to use it would only end one way. They would call him Massacre, and his name would be a curse, not a memory. He had to face them with the only weapons he had ever truly trusted, his intellect and his integrity. "Bar the back door," he told Alara. "Stay in the examination room. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I will not hide while they do this to you. I stood with you before. I will stand with you now." He saw the unwavering determination in her eyes and knew it was useless to argue. It was also the thing that gave him a strength he didn't know he possessed. He gave a short, sharp nod. "Then stand beside me." He took a deep breath, walked to the front door, and unbolted it. He did not fling it open, but pulled it back slowly, revealing himself to the mob. He stood on his own threshold, unarmed, his posture straight, his face calm. Alara was a step behind him, framed in the doorway, the warm lamplight of their home at her back and the hateful glare of the torches before her. The sight of them together, so defiant and composed, gave the mob a moment's pause. Jedediah recovered first. There he is, the devil doctor and his witch. We're here to reclaim this woman, Fletcher property, and run you out of our town, Mercer. Silas didn't address Jedediah. He scanned the crowd, his eyes landing on Sheriff Miller. Sheriff, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. You are allowing this? You are sanctioning mob rule. Miller shuffled his feet, avoiding Silas's gaze. Now, Silas, the council voted. Feelings are running high. Feelings? It was Alara who spoke, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with Silas. The crowd stirred, surprised by her voice. You call this feeling? This is cowardice. This is cruelty. You speak of me as property? I am a human being. This man, Dr. Mercer, is the only one in this entire town who has treated me as such. She pointed a trembling finger at Jedediah. You left me to be sold like cattle because I had a fever. You would have let me die. And you, she said, her gaze sweeping over the other faces she recognized from the saloon, from the general store. You would have watched. You would have laughed. You call yourselves a community? You are a pack of wolves, turning on anyone you deem weaker than yourselves. A man in the crowd shouted, She's bewitched. He's filled her head with notions. He has filled my lungs with air. Alara's voice rose, filled with a righteous fire. He has filled my body with strength. He did it with medicine, with knowledge, with simple human decency, things none of you seem to understand. She took another step forward, her fear burned away by her fury. You want to run him out of town? Then who will you call when your child falls ill? Who will set your broken bones? Who will you beg to save you when your own ignorance and hatred make you sick? This man has more honor and courage in his little finger than all of you combined. Her words struck home, hitting a nerve of truth that cut deeper than any insult. A few of the men in the back of the crowd shuffled uncomfortably. They remembered the times Dr. Mercer had come, without question, to their aid. They looked at Jedediah, a man known for his meanness, and then at the doctor, who stood with such quiet, unshakable dignity. Silas seized the moment of hesitation. You have a choice, he said, his voice resonating with authority. You can follow this man, he gestured to Jedediah, and burn down the only thing of value your prejudice has left you. Or you can go home. Go home to your families. And when you wake up tomorrow, you can decide what kind of town Redemption Creek is going to be. Jedediah, seeing his power over the mob wavering, let out a roar of frustration and lunged forward, grabbing for Alara's arm. You're coming with me, girl. Before he could lay a hand on her, Silas moved. He was not a fighter, but his movements were swift and precise. He stepped between them, blocking Jedediah's path. He didn't raise a fist. He simply stood there, an immovable object. You will not touch her, he said, his voice flat and final. The standoff was absolute. The brute force of Jedediah against the moral force of Silas. For a long, tense moment, the fate of all of them hung in the balance. Then, from the back of the crowd, a voice spoke. It was a miner, a man whose son's life Silas had saved from a snake bite the summer before. Leave them be, Fletcher, the man said gruffly. The doc's right. This ain't right. Another man nodded in agreement. The spell was broken. The mob's righteous fury dissolved into shamefaced uncertainty. They began to drift away, one by one, extinguishing their torches as they went, melting back into the darkness that had spawned them. Soon, only Jedediah, Sheriff Miller, and a couple of his closest cronies remained. Jedediah stood there, his face a thunderous mask of humiliation. He looked at Silas and Alara, standing together on their porch, illuminated and unbroken. He spat on the ground, a final, impotent gesture of his hatred. This town ain't big enough for both of us, Mercer, he snarled, before turning on his heel and stomping off into the night, his cronies trailing behind him like defeated dogs. The sheriff was the last to leave. He tipped his hat, a gesture that was both an apology and a surrender. "Doctor," he said, then turned and walked away. The night was suddenly quiet, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the wind whispering through the prairie grass. The threat was gone. They had faced the worst the town had to offer, and they had won. Not with violence, but with truth. Silas turned and looked at Alara. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes wide, but she was radiant. He reached out and cupped her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a smudge. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. She leaned into his touch, covering his hand with her own. "I am," she breathed. The air between them was charged with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. All the barriers of doctor and patient, of race, of circumstance, had been burned away by the torchlight, leaving only the profound, undeniable truth of their connection. He had saved her body. She had saved his soul. And, together, they had saved each other. He drew her gently inside, closing the door on the darkness and the hate. Inside, the fire still burned warmly in the hearth. The stew was still warm on the stove. It was just a small house on the edge of a harsh and unforgiving land, but it was their fortress. It was their sanctuary. It was home. He looked at her, standing in the middle of the room, and he knew that the $10 he'd put on that bar had been the best investment of his life. He hadn't just bought a woman's freedom. He had found his own. He watched her as she moved to the stove, her movements once again calm and purposeful, as if she were chasing the last of the night's demons from their home. She ladled the stew into 2 bowls. He looked from her face, illuminated by the firelight, to the boarded-up window, a stark reminder of the world outside. But for the first time, the world outside seemed small and distant. Everything that mattered was right here, in this room. He took the bowl she offered, their fingers brushing. It was a simple, domestic act, yet it felt like a sacrament. They had stood on the brink and had not faltered. Now, in the quiet aftermath, a new life was beginning. He saw her glance up at him, a small, hopeful smile on her lips, and he returned it. The fever was truly gone, replaced by a warmth that promised to last a lifetime. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below.